Oh, I'm the naked historian, now that's just what I am. And I'm a-searching for history throughout this fabled land. No matter what they do, no matter what they say, I'm gonna search for the history of the gal in blue and gray.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now I know that you guys are technically on vacation this weekend, but I am going to make you work just a little bit today. And I'm going to throw a little phrase out there. It's probably something that is very familiar to you. And all I need you guys to do is fill in the blank at the end. Behind every great man is an even greater woman. Outstanding. I said that same thing at a men's fellowship once, and there was dead silence. So I don't know if they didn't want to admit it or they were just plain dumb, but as a fellow guy, it was probably somewhere in between. But yes, behind every great man is a great woman, and I sincerely believe that. My presentation today is about George Washington's mother, Mary Ball. Not only was she the mother of the father of our country, but she was also a farm woman who has a deep legacy in the Fredericksburg region, and in my mind, she grew greatness, both literally and figuratively. And I have some visual aids that I'm going to use today, so I'll just tell you guys when to look left or right. Now, just a few miles from this very spot sits the site of Ferry Farm. Could I have next slide, please? If you look at the image on the left-hand side, that is the entrance to the childhood home of George Washington, and next to it is the Mary Washington House, which is where Mary spent her last years. And as I said, just a few miles from this spot sits the site of Ferry Farm, which is the childhood home of our nation's first president, and a little further down in town stands the house of Mary Washington. Now, both of these places, like many of the historic places in Fredericksburg, host thousands of tourists each and every year. Yet the woman who spent the most time living at both of these locations tends to be forgotten time and time again in favor of her offspring. Now, this is understandable, but Mary Ball Washington's memory, and why she was so appropriate, I think, for today, is because her story was not only woven into the fabric of our history here in Fredericksburg, but it is also written in the legacy of farm women, remarkable farm women such as yourselves. Mary Ball Washington was a woman of great virtue, which is no surprise when you read about her family and her son, and she was a very complex woman. According to her friends and family, she was truly beloved, but she was equally stubborn and could be quite infuriating at times. She was a wife who was widowed at a very young age, and also a mother who struggled in her relationships with her children for a period. Most notably, she was a Christian and is said to have constantly found strength in her faith. And like every one of us, she believed in Jesus, and she was far from perfect. Next slide, please. Mary Ball was born right here in Lancaster County, Virginia in 1708 and was one of many children in a combined family, sort of a colonial-era Brady Bunch, so to speak. Her father was a gentleman whose name was Joseph Ball, and her family was located in Epping Forest, where Joseph married her mother, the widow Mary Johnson. He had immigrated there from England to Virginia around 1650. Now, unfortunately, as it often happened in those days due to the lack of medical knowledge and technology, people succumbed to illnesses at very young ages, and Mary's parents were no difference to that. She was left fatherless at the age of 3 and motherless at the age of 12 or 13. As an orphan, Mary was placed in accordance with the terms of her father's will under the guardianship of a gentleman named Mr. George Eskridge, who was a local attorney and a close friend of the Ball family. Now, for the next decade, Mary would live with the Eskridge family and her married half-sister, Elizabeth Bonham. And although we don't have very many records available on her life in this period, we do know that she was educated, that she was an avid reader, and that she was a very skilled horse rider. Now, this quality of upbringing following the untimely death of your parents was a blessing to be for sure. Many orphans in those days ended up on the streets or left in unloving homes. So Mary was very, very fortunate that she was moved under the care of a family friend who was also a successful lawyer who could provide an income and a way of nurturing her. So she was blessed right from the beginning. And because of that, she was given the opportunity to grow into what is considered to be a well-bred young woman. Now, as I said, Mary was very, very lucky under these circumstances, but in retrospect, I don't necessarily think that she appreciated that fact. And I say that as she became older, her stubborn streak took over, and she often complained that her children left her destitute and neglected, which was far from the truth. In 1731, Mary, who was 23 years old at the time and considered to be an old maid by colonial standards, met a strapping old gentleman by the name of Augustine Washington. Augustine's family, much like Mary's family, had been in the colonies since the mid-1600s. And he was also a well-educated gentleman, but he was educated in England, so his upbringing was similar and yet very different from hers. He was a well-established widower who was 14 years her senior, with 3 children, Lawrence, Augustine, and Jane. So what you have here is a successful 37-year-old man, which is my age, and he is getting ready to marry a 23-year-old woman. So that's not a bad deal. Not at all. I married an older woman to make... So the following February, after they marry, Mary begins to give birth to one of the 6 children that they're going to have together. And can anybody tell me what the name of her firstborn son may have been? George. Very good. There's a picture of him hanging up there. You guys are on the ball today. Now, they named him George, of course, after George Eskridge, who had been her adopted father that had taken care of her. And the Washington family, they were well off. They were not considered to be elites at the time. They were not aristocrats. They were not extremely wealthy, but they were very successful at a regional level, and they would build their wealth over time. So they lived a very, very comfortable life. Could I have the next slide, please? And of course, that is the famous image of George and his father at the famous cherry tree. Now, we have no photographs of Mary Ball Washington, but we do have several documented impressions. Next slide, please. These images are of her. She was very tall and said to resemble her son. Her cousins found her to have a very kind expression, to be a very pleasant woman. Lafayette is said to have likened her to a Roman matron, while Eleanor Parke Custis, who was the wife of Betty Lewis' son Lawrence, described her as remarkably plain in her dress. So the impressions of Mary was that she was pretty and she was also a bit plain. That had to do with her modesty at the time, too. The Washington family was very modest people, and George is a testament to that, as you learn a little bit later on. This family at the time lived at a beautiful place called the Pope's Creek Plantation, which was later renamed Wakefield. And there they prospered and had many more children. So in the end, Mary and Augustine would actually have 6 kids together on top of the children that they brought to the marriage together. So they had George, Betty, Samuel, John Augustine, Charles, and Mildred. So they were a very busy couple. Next slide, please. Now, in 1736, the Washington family moved to a place called Hunting Creek, which you realize is later named Mount Vernon. And in 1738, Augustine purchased Ferry Farm to be closer to his iron business. Now, it is then that the family moved and they settled right here in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I would like to add, too, that the name Ferry Farm did not come along until years later. While they lived there, it was simply known as the Washington Farm. Now, I'd like to take a moment to speak a little bit about Mary Ball Washington's mother, because that is a dominant part of her personality in her presentation here. Although there will be difficult years to come, Mary was said to have always been a very loving and caring parent. She had a great relationship with her children early on. And historians have traced George's epic honesty and fortitude to his upbringing, which, of course, Mary had a large part in. And to reinforce this, I would like to read a very short passage from a publication on the subject of Mary called Archiving in Early America, Mary Ball Washington. And it says, "To Mary Ball Washington, we owe the precepts and example that governed her son throughout his life. The moral and religious maxims found in her favorite manual, which was titled Sir Matthew Howell's Contemplations, made an indelible impression on George. His memory and his heart would always sing praises of this, and she had read them aloud to her children, and this had been embedded in his memory. That small volume with his mother's autograph inscribed was among the most treasured treasures of George Washington's library as long as he lived. When George was 14 years old, his half-brother Lawrence obtained a midshipman's warrant for him in the English naval service. George made plans to embark on board a man of war then in the Potomac. His baggage was already on the ship, but at the last minute his mother arrived and refused to give her consent, preventing her son from a life that would have cut him off from the great career that was to come, and the great careers that he would eventually pursue. A noted biographer described her action as the debt owed by mankind to the mother of Washington. In other words, if she had never gone and pulled her son off of that ship, he probably would have never become president of the United States. Now that is quite an endorsement, to say the least. And it was here at Ferry Farm that Mary's husband unfortunately died. In 1743, he passed away unexpectedly at the age of 49. So now we have Mary, who had been orphaned at the age of 12 or 13, now widowed with 5 children at the tender age of 35 years old. So that is quite a state. George, who was only 11 years old at the time of his father's death, was given a portion of the property. Under Augustine's will, Mount Vernon was given to George's half-brother Lawrence, who would have been the proper son of his father, and George received 600 acres at Ferry Farm. Because he was only 11 years old at the time, a provision was added that would allow Mary to receive the full benefit of the crops for 5 years until George was old enough to take over the property. Next slide, please. Now, Augustine's other sons were, as we say, all grown up and gone, so George's job was to be the man of the house, and his mother depended on him greatly. That said, she did allow her son to move to Mount Vernon to live with his brother 2 years later, and of course there's a photograph of Mount Vernon as it stands today. Now, of course, there is a tale that circulates at this time. The Washington family legacy is filled with tales, whether it's George chopping down a cherry tree or skipping a silver dollar across the Rappahannock River. And I can't tell you for sure if this is fact or fiction, but it's such a good story and it speaks to her tenacity. And as I referenced in that last package, at the impressionable age of 14, George was offered that position as a midshipman in the Royal Navy. And of course, his mother opposed the idea of her firstborn sailing off into the sunset, so she rushed to Mount Vernon and demanded that he not enlist. Now, the addition to the story is this. It is said that she later gave him a beautiful penknife as a consolation gift, and that she had it engraved with the words, "Always obey your superiors," which I believe in parent speak means listen to your mother. And he did. He did listen to his mother. He did not enlist. Mary stayed at the Ferry Farm, and she continued to manage the working of the land for years. In fact, she would live in Fredericksburg for more than 45 years at the time of her death, and she never ever remarried. And there were opportunities. So I think that in itself is a testament to her constitution and her strong will. Years passed by, and unfortunately the relationships between Mary and George began to deteriorate. Although she was by no means poor, she regularly complained to outsiders that George had ignored her, left her destitute, and neglected. And this became a great embarrassment to Washington. He did a lot of speaking engagements as well, and he would go out and people would say things to him that they had heard through the grapevine about the relationship with his mother, and it was something that followed him for quite some time. Slide, please. Now, that said, we still have correspondence today that shows that regardless of the strain on their relationship, George always held strong affections for his mother. He gave her a letter, which I have up on the screen there, in 1755, following a particular military engagement early on in his career that was simply meant to reassure his mother that he was safe. And if you look at the signature on this letter and the series of letters that go with it, he always signs them, "Your most dutiful son." So he took time to write to his mother when he was a colonel in the militia, when he was a general in the army. Always made sure to write Mom. Next slide, please. Now, at the age of 64, Mary Ball Washington was becoming too old to run the farm. There was simply too much for her to do. So in 1772, George purchased a home for her in downtown Fredericksburg, and this is a photo of the home today. It is the Mary Washington house. She would live in this house for the remaining 17 years of her life, and actually you can go and tour this facility, and they've done a wonderful job of preserving both the exterior and the interior. When the War for Independence began, the now General George Washington, of course, took command of the Continental Army in June of 1775. And he went off to war, and he did not see his mother again for over 10 years. So he was deployed for a decade and had no opportunity to get down here to Virginia to visit his mother. Despite this rift, though, he was a gentleman that people felt the need to honor him, so he was invited to a lot of events where people would bestow awards and favors on him for the service that he gave to his country. And one of Mary's proudest moments came during a visit to one of those events that took place right here in Fredericksburg in February of 1784. And at that time, he arrived to accept the honors of the town. And in his thankful speech that he gave, he said, "My reverend mother, by whose maternal hand, early deprived of a father, I was led to manhood." So he actually not only acknowledged his mother, but he gave her credit for the successes that he had had. George continued until the very end to pay Mary's rent, both at the Mary Washington House and for all the livestock and slaves at Ferry Farm. And he strongly urged her in 1787 to move from that house and to move in with one of her children. It was thought that she might move in with her son John. Unfortunately, John died before that could take place, and it was never spoke of again. Next slide, please. 2 years later, the now President-elect George Washington paid his last visit to his mother here in Fredericksburg in April of 1789, 4 months before she would die. He was en route to New York for his inauguration to take the office of President of the United States, and it is said that only then did the two of them reunite and repair their relationship. George Washington Parke Custis, who was the president's adopted son, gave a moving account of Mary Washington's last meeting, and this is an excerpt from what he wrote. He wrote, "Immediately after the organization of the present government, the chief magistrate, Washington repaired to Fredericksburg to pay his humble duty to his mother, in preparatory for his departure for New York. An affecting scene ensued. He told her, 'I have come to bid you an affectionate farewell. So soon as the weight of public business which must necessarily attend the outset of a new government can be disposed of, I shall hasten back to Virginia.'" And here his mother interrupted him. She said, "And you will see me no more. My great age and the disease which is fast approaching my vitals warn me that I will not be long in this world. I trust in God that I may be somewhat prepared for the better place I am about to go. And I pray, George, that you fulfill the high destinies which heaven appears to have intended for you. Go, my son, and may heaven's and your mother's blessing be with you always." Next slide, please. George, of course, went on to serve his country. And Mary Ball Washington would die at the tender age of 81 from cancer in the first year of his presidency. She was buried nearby on the Lewis Plantation, just a few steps from a place called Meditation Rock. And Meditation Rock is an area where tradition has it that this was Mary's favorite place to retreat for reading, for prayer, and for meditation. And to me as a historian, I find it very fitting that a woman who was so connected to the area's land would be returned to it upon her death. This is a plaque that is at the base of Meditation Rock, and if you could read that, it says, "Here Mary Ball Washington prayed for the safety of her son and country during the dark years of the American Revolution." Her memory remained, and in the 1830s, the women of Fredericksburg all banded together to raise funds to create a monument that would pay homage to Mary Ball Washington. And the following year, a prominent gentleman named Silas Burroughs of New York offered to pay for it in full. In laying the cornerstone, Andrew Jackson said, "Mary Washington acquired and maintained a wonderful ascendancy over those around her. This true characteristic of genius attended through her life, and she conferred upon her son the power of self-command, which was one of the remarkable traits of her own character. She conducted herself through this life with virtue and prudence worthy of the mother of the greatest hero that ever adorned the annals of American history." Next slide, please. Now, unfortunately, that marker, like much of the town, would be destroyed during the American Civil War. And the original one up here is located on the left-hand side, that photograph. And people at the time were very upset. They said that of all the monuments that needed to be immediately rebuilt, that was one of the ones that they were adamant about. They created another one, and they laid the stone in 1893. And when it was formally dedicated by President Grover Cleveland, it simply had the inscription that reads, "Mary, the Mother of Washington," which I find very fitting. I find that dedication fitting because it reinforces the adage of where we started today. Behind the great Washington was another great Washington, and in some respects, perhaps an even greater Washington. who supported her family and her farm and was able to sustain them all by herself. So as I close today, I would like to refer to a passage of Scripture that sums up the lessons that I believe we can learn from the life and legacy of Mary Ball Washington, a mother, a farmer, and a devout believer. It is from the book of Ephesians, 6 verses 1 through 3. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on this earth." Thank you, and God bless.